Thank you very much for the generous introduction, and thank you for inviting me. In this talk, I will offer one empirical example, one possible interpretation of what polycontextualization could mean in relationship to design practice, designing and archiving as two dimensions of architectural creativity. I will start by introducing archives, and I will focus in particular on architectural design archives, but there are features of archives and archiving that connect to other fields, and you can interpret this according to the discipline you're coming from. Archive often evokes a musty place, full of drawers, dim lights, filing cabinets, pretty much similar to what we see on the picture, shelves, and it is either understood as a place containing records, objects, the archive as a house, as an institution, or it is just a collection of such materials from which history emerges, like the scent from old books, the archive as a source. In both these forms, the archive is not an inert repository of artifacts of historical value, but it is an active discursive system, a semantic machine that produces historical meaning. So this dual nature of archive as an institution, as a source, as a house, and archive as a source, this dual nature has been the object of many studies from contemporary historians, philosophers, and art scholars during the past 2-3 decades, I would say. Yet, it somehow escaped the attention of architectural scholars. So this study is motivated by a number of recent developments in the social sciences and the arts dating back to the 90s. First, the archival fever in the arts with the writings of Jacques Derrida and Paul Ricoeur as key protagonists of thinking the role of archiving as a tool of memory. So the archival fever, or le mal d'archive, as Derrida coins this term, is the desire to remember that is found on the drive to distraction. The fear of that makes us archive, store, collect. This entire discussion in philosophy happens in the 90s, the mid-90s. Second, in anthropology, at the same time, we witness, again in the mid-90s, we witness the emergence of the trend of archival ethnography, of an archival turn, so to say, in the field of anthropology. So the precise expression archival ethnography comes from Michael Sachlin's Historical Ethnography, 1992 publication that every anthropologist is familiar with, and points to a historical research technique that aims at adapting ethnography to account for the lived experience from the past. So again, in the 90s, in anthropology, we witness a huge interest in archives, in archiving, in rethinking even what ethnography means in connection to archives. Third, in archival science, precisely at that moment, in the mid-90s, we witness a huge empirical interest in new methodologies. So usually analysis of what it means to be an archivist of architecture tends to come from the archivists themselves. And this body of knowledge emerges as a recollection and categorization of archival practices. However, in the mid-90s, we witnessed this empirical turn in archival science, and all these developments in philosophy, developments in anthropology and archival science, open up new avenues for exploring architectural archiving in the field of the urban. So the 1990s is also the moment when the computer enters architectural practices and radically transforms the way we design. The paper drawing becomes precious precisely because the computer is there. archives pile up in the offices and big firms, and a lot of firms begin appointing archivists and record managers in the practices. We witnessed the very first traces of archival fever in architectural practices. Peter Eisenman, for instance, recalls, people were telling me, this is a quote, people were telling me, why aren't you signing your drawings? The CCA, the Canadian Centre of Architecture, will not take the drawings unless I did sign them. So I signed them eventually after the fact, and I never signed drawings at the start. I was not conscious. So there's certainly a contrast to be drawn with the impulsive way art, anthropology, and history scholars felt under the contagious influence of the archival fever during the past 2-3 decades. In architectural studies, somehow, however, there is still a noticeable silence on the archival front. Somehow the archival fever did not manage to infect a lot the field of architectural studies, perhaps because the fever was already in practice and not that much in the field of theorizing space and theorizing archiving. Some recent studies in history of architecture have shown more, albeit implicit, awareness of archive formations. Historians discuss the limitations and constructions of archives, the specific relationship between the document and the historian, the role that archives play in the methodology of historical writing. Nevertheless, none of these studies explicitly addressed architectural archives, only en passant. Interestingly, scholars only notice the archive when it troubles them. The archive only becomes an object of study when an architect is effaced from official historiography, or a facet of an architectural personality is overlooked, or in situations of major lacunas, of accidental distraction, of economic crisis, or striking contrast between abundant and poor sources, or the daunting threat that someone else will write this history. When it serves the historian, the archive is invisible, mute, unchallenged, in a footnote. When it troubles the historian, it resurfaces and it interferes epistemologically. Addressing this gap in architectural scholarship, my ambition is to shift the attention to the realities of archive making. So the aim is to explore the specific mechanisms of archive production by tracing how architecture objects become archival. Or this is another way to ask the question that you deal with in this symposium, how connections between different contextures are being traced so as to make sense. So looking at how ordinary architecture objects, drawings, models become archival, objects of value, objects that enter the golden books of architectural history, what is this process? What tracing this process is what I do as an anthropologist. Being interested equally in the material and epistemic dimensions of this process, and also scrutinizing the way archiving matters for practicing architects, because archiving does not have sense on its own. It's always connected to designing. And the connection between design and the production of archive is an organic one, which is what I intend to show today. So it's important to understand first to what extent and how architecture archives reflect the nature of design as a collective, heterogeneous, and social process. And second, how situated and local practices of arranging, cataloging, taking care and preserving objects happen to produce larger structuring effects in an archive. Effects that resonate with greater epistemological anxieties in the discipline and the profession. So embarking in an anthropology of knowledge production in architecture, I ask, what constitutes an architectural archive? What are the tools, the documentary techniques and experimental tactics needed for the production of archives. How is the dialogue with current architectural practices nurturing this production? To do this, I rely on ethnographic observation, actor network theory-inspired ethnography, of the practices of archivists, catalogers, conservators, and other actors involved in this process. And I remain attentive to the places of knowledge production and care, to the objects, the attitudes, the forms of life, to all those little and insignificant things which in their totality, little by little, step by step, allow us to understand what architectural archiving is. So I advocate a type of architectural anthropology that pays attention to the production of architectural knowledge in its mundane, down-to-earth, practical and factual materiality. I draw on the inspiration from the symmetric anthropology of Bruno Latour and pay equal attention to human actors and a number of non-human actors involved in this process, such as architectural models, solvents, instruments like spatula, and microscopes, and many other objects that take part in the process. To illustrate what the study is about, I will invite you to take a look at the institution where I conducted my ethnographic study. So this is the Canadian Centre of Architecture. And for the architects and architectural scholars, the institution does not need an introduction. It's a leading archival institution which contains many archives of architects from the second half of 20th century, focusing mainly on post-war architecture, and it has a large number of Canadian, North American architects, but its collection is growing as well. And in the recent years, the CCA started acquiring a number of European architects, and now there's a new project in focusing on Africa, so it's expanding the collection also to other geographic areas. So, but it's not the visible CCA, the visible institution that I am interested in. It's not an analysis of the institutional politics of the CCA. It's not a study of the CCA per se. CCA is just the place of ethnographic observation. So it's not the object of study, but it's the locus of study. That's where I happen to be and follow archivists at work. It's in a way the hidden CCA that I was interested in. There are many different locales in which archiving happens. The invisible CCA, the CCA that usually we don't see. This study took me to visit the vaults of the CCA, where I meet different archivists, and other sites of archiving, such as the shipping area, where the objects arrive in the CCA and are first opened by registered people who will open the box and will smell the content of the box before they even unpack it and catalog the objects. The vaults with the collections, the conservation lab where the objects are being restored and repaired and being taken care of, which is a quasi-scientific lab, as well as we're still in the conservation lab here, so we can see all sorts of quasi-scientific objects like the microscope and many other objects. In a way, this very first encounter with the hidden CCA, with the places where the objects have an invisible social life, was extremely fascinating for me. So the very first moment of encounter was in 2014 when I witnessed for the first time in the vaults. I had like a guided tour in the vaults, and I have been shown some images of Chandigarh, the Le Corbusier's picture of Chandigarh, which were extremely interesting for me as an architectural theorist. I couldn't stop myself reaching out to the drawings of Chandigarh and trying to touch them. So I'll never forget this moment, because at the moment at that very moment in the vaults, when my hand tried to perform an iconoclastic gesture, I heard a very vocal and collective no. And this no is a no that I still remember, and I try to unpack as an anthropologist. So this no meant, the no was a very collective no by all the archivists, conservators, librarians, and people gathered around this table with the Chandigarh drawings. But the no also denoted an acute awareness of the importance of archives and also worry about distraction. No, don't touch them, you'll destroy the drawings, because every single finger leaves oil prints on the drawing. This attention to preservation and worry about the objects was collectively expressed, not by one single person, by a collective of persons. A society of friends were there to protect the architecture objects, to take care of them, but also to speak on behalf of those objects. It is precisely that subtle balance between preservation and distraction that defines an archiving institution. And as an anthropologist, I wanted to understand how an archival institution sustains this balance between preservation and distraction, which was all contained in the vocal no, trying to stop my gesture. So tracing these hidden places where the objects circulate in the CCA, I could notice that the objects have two modalities of existence, or two types of agencies. I demonstrated as well. In the galleries, so you can see this on the right-hand side, in the galleries, you see stabilized, eloquent objects, objects capable to talk about architecture, history, urban history, and theory, objects that are in perfect control of their environment. In the hidden sites of archiving, where, for instance, we can see David using a microscope to look at a drawing that is in urgent need of preservation, of care. So in all those hidden sites, in the labs, in the workshops, in the photo lab, in the conservation lab, in the vaults, the objects are constantly negotiating with the environment, battling uncertainty, begging for care. They cannot talk. They're stammering objects. Whereas in the galleries, the objects are confident, eloquent, stabilized. So in the labs, in the hidden spaces, the speech is interrupted, hesitant, completed by gestures and instruments, while in the gallery, humans talk on behalf of objects. On the site of archiving, objects talk only through the trials, through the lab equipment, the controversies, and the script. So that's a striking difference to witness when we follow archiving in the making, and we witness the secret life of architecture objects. To illustrate to illustrate this, I'll take one particular case, this is the work of archiving Caesar's acquisition. So to understand archiving, we need to visit a number of sites. So it's not enough just to stay in Montreal, in this huge institution, in this huge, and visit all the sites of archiving, but we need also to visit other sites. So picture this scene. The focus, I have to explain here that the interest in scissor was because in 2015, when I started this project, the very first boxes of scissors archive arrived in the CCA, and I decided to follow this. Yeah.
There might be 90% in the room that have no idea who Caesar is.
Okay, right. Alvaro Siza, I meant. Yeah, Alvaro Siza is a modernist architect, one of the leading modernist architects famous with his post-war architecture. There's a famous building in Berlin, which probably everybody knows. Bonjour Tristesse, in the Schlesisches Tor, I think it's Schlesisches. Right, yeah, in Kreuzberg. So it's one of his very first buildings. He's very famous with social housing projects in the 70s, and quite an iconic figure for Portuguese architecture, one of the leading modernist architects, I would say. He's now in his 80s, 83, 84, and I had the chance to interview him recently on the occasion of this project. So I'll tell the story of how one architect of his caliber, I would say one of the leading architects of 20th century, ended up in the CCA, and how his work, and he's still very active, although he's in his 80s, his brain is probably sharper than mine, and he's still very active and producing a lot of work. So it's an active design practice, I would say. That's why it's an interesting case study for me. And at the same time, he had to take care of his legacy, and he had to think carefully about his archive and whether the archive stays in Portugal and goes to Montreal, and which part of the archive goes where. So the archive had to be distributed very carefully. So this was also a very important decision in terms of which locales of archiving are mobilized and in which context. So I started following this process of the acquisition of CISA, and CISA was also, as I mentioned, because the CCA was focusing mainly on North American and British architects. In the recent years, they decided to acquire more European architects, focusing on Spanish, Italian, Portuguese architects, and recently, as I said, also African and other architects, so expanding the geographical scope of the archives. So CISA was one of the first archives that was part of this strategy of the institution to expand beyond the North American focus. Because the architect is based in Porto, I had to travel back and forth between Porto and Montreal to understand how archiving happens also across different contexts, across different geographies, but also institutional logics of archiving as well. So picture one scene, Porto. A large office at Rua de Alexo, a man in his 80s, models, letters, an archive, and smoke. You would be surprised, but CISA is smoking in his office, and he's smoking in the archive, he's smoking everywhere, hence the camel pack of cigarettes. So smoke, dispersed sketches everywhere, and ashes menacing the fragile paper, floating through the air like dust. This is Alvaro Siza in this first scene, in this first context. His archive, his past piling up in the office and ordered in his practice, in his possession. Scene 2, we are in Montreal. Big boxes arrive, so this is in 2015 when the first part of the archive arrived in Montreal. Big boxes are placed in this immaculately clean vault space. CCA archivist Adria, which you meet here, wears gloves to manipulate the drawings and to open the boxes. A man in his 80s visits the vaults. Pristine, shiny floors, silence. The man is inspecting the boxes, a pack of cigarettes, yet a lack of smoke. Alvaro Siza is in the premises of the CCA. The archive has arrived in Montreal, but because the archive is already in possession of the CCA, Alvaro is not allowed to smoke. So as soon as the archive arrives at the CCA, it achieves an archival standard, and it's not scissors anymore. So there is a change from an intellectual point of view and from a physical point of view. So in this different context, the archive has to be organized according to different rules, and the creator of the archive, Caesar, is supposed to play according to the rules of this institution. So he cannot smoke anymore. We have to wonder what happens to the archive between these two different scenes, between Porto and Montreal. The route from office to collection has an important effect on the materials themselves, and they acquire a collection mode of existence. What is an archive, you might wonder? So what do we find in these boxes? And how are these boxes prepared from the office of Caesar, which, as I said, is still a very active office, to Montreal, and how from this institution, from the CCA, they enter architectural history. So this trajectory is extremely interesting to follow. Archives document the livings of an architect. They contain the multiplicity of working drawings that document the thinking process of designers and the social and cultural issues of architecture. So the archive is not about the star architect only. It's about many other contextual details and research process that happened in the office and that document different contexts, cultural, technical, political, and social contexts that were involved in a particular project, and traces of research that accompanied this design process remain in the archival boxes. So the archive emerges as this kind of broader entity of drawings plus other things. So it could be, for instance, drawings plus library objects, different books that inspired an architect, paintings, correspondence, tools, paintbrushes, sculptures, photographs, etc. So the archive is this entire inspirational and contextual apparatus that makes architecture possible. So it's not just a reflection of the architectural mind. It's not just drawings or produced by a powerful mind, nor is it just a reflection of one particular context, social, political, technical. So already in the box with archival materials, we see polycontexturalization in action. So drops of different contexts, not reflection, not intentional reflections of entire contextual context into the box, into the architectural materials, but drops of context, and all those drops, they are left as the remaining materials from the design process of creativity. Everything that was mobilized so that the project could happen. And in that sense, the archive is this contextual, reflects this contextual apparatus that makes architectural projects possible. And every single archive is organized in series, which also reflect different activities in a practice. So the projects reflect, for instance, in Caesar's case, the project reflect the professional practice, so that's the first series, and then there are sketchbooks, which were found in his house, and he didn't want to donate the sketchbooks because he thought the sketchbooks are not related to the professional projects, but documented his travels. Then they became part of the archive, materials from teaching, publications, so all the different activities are also organized in different series. So to organize this heterogeneous assembly of things that the archive is, of things that come from different contexts and are already work as a contexture, we need a number of actors. So this cannot happen in one place only. We need a number of actors that travel from place to place. A number of archivists work to make the Caesar font possible. So to understand how Caesar arrives at the CCA, we need to trace the trajectory of the archive, of all these objects, as well as the number of actors that take place in the acquisition. So we have the directors of the CCA at the time, Mirko Zardini, and the collection director, Martin, talking about the negotiations to acquire the archive, Phyllis Lambert talking about the split, Giovanna, the chief curator of the CCA at the time, talking about the rationale of CISA joining the CCA. And then we have a number of archivists, all organized in a network to archive the material that comes from this architectural practice. Adria and Pamela in Montreal, Magda and Chiara in Porto, and of course the architect CISA himself. So all these actors, all together in different locales of practice, have to come into an organized network of contextures to be able to archive the material coming from this practice. So the key actor, however, is not the star architect CISA. The key actor is his archivist, Chiara. And I would like to tell you the story of Chiara in more details. Chiara is an invisible actor, and in the Golden Books of Architectural History, we will know all about CISA, his childhood, his great projects, his genius ideas, but we'll never learn anything about the invisible actors. And one of those invisible actors is Chiara, the archivist, who made possible the organization of his work in a way that architectural scholars and researchers could consult it. So Chiara was trained as an architect, and she started working with CISA in the 80s on a number of projects, and at the end of the 90s, she became his archivist. In the 90s, a number of influential projects, such as the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Porto, the Chiado and the Torrent van CISA, many projects were already in the office. The office was extremely successful, and it became extremely difficult to search for materials in the piles. So Chiara started organizing this material. She introduced the original order. The original order is an important term in archiving because the original order reflects as much as possible the order in which the documents are created in the context of an architectural practice, in an architectural firm. And the original order keeps this particular relational arrangement. The arrangement of the material closely also mirrored Chiara's knowledge of CISA's practice. And she started organizing the material as if they were all architectural projects, separating the drawings from the correspondence. And this profound knowledge of the different phases of architectural projects helped her to develop a plan for the archival organization. So with the years of practice, Chiara learned where things stand. So this is the kingdom of Chiara on the ground floor in the practice of CISA. And the archiving started in the 90s. So Alvaro CISA is one of the first architects who appointed an archivist to organize the material and structure the archive. So this is where she works, and everything is organized in a perfect way. It's a pristine place where everything is catalogued and numbered. So with the years of practice, Chiara learned where things stand in an archive, on that particular shelf or in that particular drawer. So knowing where to locate things is the specific archival knowledge of Chiara. Although she spent 20 years working in the practice and working alongside CISA, she's not an expert in CISA. She cannot possibly know everything about his work. The encyclopedic knowledge about CISA's architecture is not Chiara's expertise. Chiara has this very specific expertise of knowing where to find things. And it is through inserting, inspecting, carefully watching and inspecting drawings, memorizing and organizing as repetitive series of operations that she acquired this specific knowledge of where. So the minute skill of knowing where is often compared to this grandiose ambition of knowing everything about Caesar and his oeuvre that crosses many different fields. He does many different other things, sculpture, paintings, exhibits, he writes, he's in fashion, he even designed glasses. So nobody can know everything about his work. But archiving is about knowing little, but knowing it well and knowing where to find more. On the second floor, in Caesar's practice, is overflowing with surprises because there's still a lot of projects. As I said, this is a very active practice, and a project only travels downstairs to Kara's archival room when it is stopped or put on hold or completed. So Caesar and Kara communicate on a daily basis. Designing and archiving need to be connected on a daily basis. They're not two disconnected dimensions of architectural practice. Caesar, the lead architect, and Kara communicate daily. We see Kara preparing a drawing for Caesar, taking it upstairs. He calls her many times, even during the interviews. They communicate all the time. She joins for the interviews. The practice and the archive are always in communication. So have a look, for instance, at some materials that Caesar had just given to Kara. It's not even a selection, it's something that was on his desk, a random compilation of things, a bunch of things that contains a little bit of everything, and on the front page, there's a message that reads, from architect Caesar to Kara. So it's Kara's task to open this folder with many different things, inspect them carefully, find the difference, and put them in different folders and organize the material. So because of the constant dialogue with practice, with the time, Kara has cultivated a very special skill to recognize Caesar's handwriting and his, of course, drawing style. She can recognize immediately whether it's Caesar or one of his collaborators or someone outside the office who is trying to imitate Caesar. So his collaborators often try to mimic the way he draws, and these differences are very hard to detect. Only Kara can detect those very tiny differences, and she has gradually cultivated the skill to distinguish between the drawing. So these hardly noticeable variances can tell a lot about the hidden working and collaborative dynamics in architectural practices. In a way, Kara is decoding some kind of hieroglyphs on the surface of these drawings that signal to other contexts of practice, to other socio-spatial dimensions of architectural practice. She can also detect hand drawings over the years. For instance, she can, because with the time, Caesar changed his way of handwriting, as every single person, our handwriting is also evolving. So Kara is capable of recognizing Caesar's handwriting style from the 60s compared to the 80s, or the 50s compared to the 70s. So all these kind of differences are there. A sketch from a completely different project also can land on the drawings of another building, and it bears traces of the ability of the architect to also work on a number of different projects from different contexts. And again, Kara is the only one who can detect those differences and bring the contexts together. And I can continue the list of different other examples. So thus we see that a drawing has many layers of information coming from different contexts that can only an archivist can grasp. It bears witness to a collective and complex design venture. Drawings allow reading the process of collaborations and reveal inherent operational dynamics. With the time, Caesar also changed his way of doing things. His drawing and handwriting techniques evolved tremendously, and nothing really stayed the same. Just as Kara had developed her skills to evaluate the differences in Caesar's work, Caesar developed his own skills, and the buildings of Caesar have changed as well. All the buildings from the 60s and the 70s, they have aged, and they have also changed. So this is a challenge of completing an archive alongside an architect who continues to work, create, and evolve. Thus, as Chiara worked on organizing the material, the archive trained her to detect those differences and those different contextures. Caesar often also comes downstairs from the second floor to the ground floor to learn from the archive, to learn from Chiara's expertise to detect differences, and consult old projects. This is something I also witness in Peter Eisenman's practice in New York. Records are kept, very often files, correspondence, models, current projects, because the architect takes care of the living building. The building is there, it ages, things break, have to be repaired, and the building also requires the architect to go back to the archive, consult the archive, and go back to the aging building. Again, 3 different contexts are mobilized in archiving, as archiving connects to designing. Eisenman, for instance, explains, quote, the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin was built 10 years ago, but we are still negotiating, like some stones have cracked, that's what he says, and things like that. So these are the records that you are legally required to keep, so you can go back to the memorial and repair. The archive allows both Caesar and Eisenman, we see here, to re-examine all projects and intervene in the built structures. It holds a library of things, so it's not a passive repository of documents or drawings, just boxes, but it's an active library of things that could be reused at any time and mobilized in designing. It allows the architect to re-examine all projects as buildings also age and need constant interventions. It operates as a mediator, active mediator, between buildings and design practices, and that is why the archive is important. Thus, placing projects in relation to others, detecting tiny difference, just like an Egyptologist will read different hieroglyphs to understand the surface of things, tracing new connections, Chiara performs a skeletal epistemological structuring of the work of Caesar that will eventually become imprinted in the classification scheme of the archive and will prepare the ground for the work of the researchers. So that's why archivists are important. So by generating this knowledge where, archivists lead to the production of knowledge about the factual knowledge. Back to Montreal, the work continues. So these are some of the drawings. So back to Montreal, the work continues, and the boxes arrive at the CCA. Archivists engaged in rehousing the material, placing the material in different boxes, and tracing different connections, new connections between the material. Rehousing is not simply about moving materials from acid to acid-free folders, but also about establishing new epistemological connections through physical displacements. So this is, for instance, Adria taking out the sketchbooks from the boxes, flipping through the sketchbooks to identify which projects they're connected to, and tracing those connections between sketchbooks and projects, so that she is also engaging in a very similar epistemological structuring of the material, so that this epistemological skeletal structuring could prepare the ground for research. And for engaged interaction with the work. So this afternoon, for instance, I visit the vaults and I follow Adria cataloging the material, going through the materials of Bonjour Tristesse, the German project we just mentioned, and completing a very detailed Excel sheet, numbering and describing the materials, and through the moves of rehousing the material, Adria is also able to extract new knowledge. She finds information that she was not able to see before. She takes a note, and then she adds this note to the file. So this is already new knowledge extracted and added to the information to be attached to the file. So Adria is also constantly connecting to Porto. So the two contexts, the two broader contexts of the archive, Porto and Montreal, connect on a daily basis. In every single material operation of archiving, we can see the two locales of practice connected. So for instance, when she goes through the material of Bonjour Tristesse project, she might have a simple question like, why is this document here? Because this all has to make sense for her first, before it's finally organized in the CCA, according to the CCA map. And if she cannot answer the simple question of why is this material here, she takes the question to Chiara, to Porto. So this simple question travels back to Porto, and the question, and if Chiara is not able to answer the question goes back to Caesar. So a simple question like this reveals both Chiara's reading of Caesar's work, as well as Caesar's own perspective on how his work is to be archived, structured, and understood by the future generations. So through rehousing, Adria gains knowledge about Caesar and his work. Far from being dull, her work is cognitively rich, leading towards the production of the CCA map of Caesar's archive. In conclusion, far from idealizing the archive as an ultimate source of architectural knowledge or a supreme technology of archival architectural history, what I advocate here is the need to study archiving, to understand this precise connection between the contextures traced by Caesar, by Adria and Chiara through the web, socio-spatial web that their archival work establishes in the two locales of practice. Archiving as a process, not just as a source, and to scrutinize also the politics of archive making. So archival materials are not just simple aesthetic artifacts, as we have seen in this very short story of acquiring a complex archive, but they are rather epistemic objects that speak on behalf of a practice, a period, or a movement. Archivists are the first to reach out to the finer ontological granularity of architecture objects in their journey to become archival. Yet, archiving is never about a specific object, but always about archiving material of larger social and cognitive importance for the discipline. It is not simply about storing. It is a way of extracting and correcting knowledge so that a more refined understanding of architecture is produced. Shifting the attention from archives as sources to archiving as a process is what I wanted to do in this talk. And I hopefully demonstrated that architectural archiving is intrinsically connected to many dispersed locales of practice. It is precisely its distributed and multi-ontic nature, mobilizing different realities of practice, that intensifies its epistemic power. That's my argument. So placing the inquiry within the heart of archiving, I demonstrated how an architectural archive conveys the contingency of the design practice and acts as a hybridizer of architecture, society, technologies, and meaning. Archiving is important as a process to be studied, We need to understand archiving better because it is the precondition of any history. In this particular case study, architectural history. So that particular process of archiving is the precondition of architectural history. Therefore, more should be done to scrutinize what constitutes an archive, what form it takes, and what system of classification and epistemology it performs. More should be done to account how an archive becomes an epistemological basis of architectural scholarship and pedagogy. Following architectural objects, as they become archival, we suddenly realize with surprise and total bewilderment how limited, complex, and unpredictable architectural objects could be, and how circumstantial, contingent, and partial the production of architectural history